Well, good afternoon and welcome to Round the Table with Kiska and Ben. It's great to see you, and I'm joined today by Andrea Williams, our Chief Executive, and also by Roger Kiska, one of our top lawyers on the Christian from the Christian Legal Centre. And we've got two stories for you this week, but let's start with one that is an important free speech win that we've had just in the last week. Case of a Christian counsellor, Mary Douglas. Roger, tell us about this case. What happened to Mary?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, it's important to know that Mary has been a counsellor in the Wiltshire Council for 15 years. She is very much openly Christian. She mentions the fact in her election material, and certainly there are a great deal of people who voted for her because of her Christian faith and her desire to have their values represented before the council. So in November, a part of Mary's portfolio is social mobility. So she hears grant applications from members of the community who want to hold events and such. And so on November 4th of last year, she heard an application on a panel of 8 from Salisbury Pride about holding a Pride event. And she was one of 2 dissenting votes as far as not wanting to provide grant money. And she thought that it was important enough to explain her reasoning why. And she said that while she loves the LGBT community and people who identify as LGBT, she couldn't in good conscience give public funds to an event which promoted an ideology. And people took great offense to that without, of course, asking her what she meant. And to me, this is the epitome of the cancel culture. They punish first and ask questions later. So this all led to a standards committee hearing complaints against her for breaching the public sector equality duty. And so we had to go through an entire hearing with written submissions, barristers and solicitors before the council, before anyone, not ironically, sadly, I would say, actually sat down with Mary and asked her, well, what did you mean by that? Or tried any mediation between her and the complainants. So we explained during that process that, Pride and LGBT campaigning are different than sexual orientation, and campaigning isn't protected by the Equality Act. The ideology she was referring to, you could easily find reading any LGBT website about deconstructing heteronormativity, looking at the election manifesto of Stonewall, that this is clearly something separate, and that she had every right to suggest that we shouldn't use public funds to support this. So at the end of the day, at the end of the hearing, the council found that she did, in fact, engage the public sector equality duty, and more importantly, that her comments were covered by Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, freedom of speech. And what I'd really like to say about this is while this win has to do with free speech, it also has to do with the fact that as Christians in Britain, people have a right to elect someone who shares their values and can express those freely before a council or before Parliament without fear of being censored or punished. And we're not there yet, clearly, given this situation.
And by the way, if you're watching, do put your questions or comments on YouTube and Facebook in the comments section, and we'll try and respond to your questions there. So, Roger, this is kind of extraordinary that it happened, though, isn't it? Because what you've got here, if I'm understanding it correctly, is an elected official who expresses a view, right? A political view, effectively. Mm-hmm. So an elected official expresses a political view, and then they get removed from their position for expressing that view. Is that right?
That's 100% correct. And that was the center of our argument, was that debate within the political spectrum enjoys the highest level of scrutiny under both common law and the convention, judicial scrutiny, that is. And there are very limited reasons by which you can interfere with that right. And in fact, since the 17th century, members of parliament have enjoyed immunity for speech that occurs during their official roles. But there are 6 legitimate reasons by which you can interfere with freedom of speech under the Human Rights Act. And the council didn't identify a single one of those. Instead, they came up with this nebulous idea that we're protecting equality considerations, and that's simply not one of the legitimate aims that justifies interfering with speech. And right reason won at the end of the day, and then the council saw that they didn't have grounds to move this forward. So we're grateful for that, but it should have never come to this.
And why do you think this is happening? That it's just shocking that it ever came to this, right? Isn't it? It's great that we had the win. Okay, fantastic. But why do you think it ever came to this? Why is it that even politicians are being shut down for expressing political views like this, which is clearly undermining democracy?
Yeah, there's seemingly an anti-Christian bias within culture, which says that expressing a biblical belief that somehow conflicts with the cultural zeitgeist is punishable. It's backwards. It's wrong. And so the gut instinct is, before asking questions, you go on the attack. That's the whole nature of the cancel culture. And I mean, at Christian Legal Center, we see it not just with Mary Douglas, but with Christy Higgs, with Felix Nagoli, with Richard Page. Just about every single one of our cases these days deals with people who, for manifesting their religious faith, are punished by a overly politically correct culture.
We've got a question here on YouTube. Should Christians involve themselves in ephemeral trends? Not quite sure what that means, Roger. Do you have an answer on that one or comment?
Well, if I'm understanding the question right, the ephemeral trend would be a grant application for a Pride event.
Right.
And in my opinion, absolutely. There were people in the early church who were members of Caesar's household. Throughout the history of Christianity, we've had elected officials who were Christian, and going before that, the whole kingship and judgeships under which Israel was run was in commune with God, and so there's a history of Judeo-Christian leadership, and I think being part of the worldly affairs and evangelizing through your witness and who you are is part of our obligation.
Yeah, and we've had quite a few legal wins, haven't we, on free speech, Roger? You mentioned one or two cases that we've got, but Felix Nagoli was a very prominent one. Did you reference that in the case?
We sure did. Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one because, I mean, that one, Court of Appeal case where a very clear judgment which said that you can't bar a Christian from a profession like social work simply for expressing their biblical views. And that expressing a biblical view is not the same as discrimination. And that's, I think, a fundamental problem in society, is that the mere expression of a Christian view is viewed as discriminatory, and it's not. It's not. Equality law requires you to discriminate against an individual on giving a certain service or an employment or otherwise. Holding a view is wholly different from that.
And just to remind everyone, he was expelled from Sheffield University, wasn't he, for expressing his view on Facebook, on his personal Facebook account. And that went over a 4-year legal process. Finally, he was cleared, and Sheffield have had to welcome him back in because they respected free speech. They were forced to respect free speech, having not respected free speech in the first place.
This is the problem. I mean, Mary had to go through this for a year, having this on her mind, and the slings and arrows that came with it from a very unkind press at times. Felix had to go through this for 4 years, and he was basically unemployable for that period because you Google him and he comes off as homophobic, which he was not, and he had to take.
Felix is just fantastic.
Yeah,
and Felix, he bear in mind he had children, his wife. He would go and take care jobs away from home, living care jobs away from home. Of course, people would love him doing that, but over a period of years, because he was removed from this course. And the same as Richard Page. And we were only in the court last week on the case of Richard Page. 5 years to get to the Court of Appeal to try and clear Richard Page's name. And also, if we think about that,
and that's, to remind people, is for saying that a child would do better with a mother and a father than with just two fathers or something like that.
That's absolutely right, and I think that that's exactly it. A man with an exemplary record, but the judges, the Court of Appeal judges in that case, they asked some really pertinent questions, and one of the judges said, and this was interesting. He said, would an Orthodox Jew be precluded from sitting as a magistrate because just by being who he is, because of how he presents himself, because people would know that an Orthodox Jew believes in one man, one woman marriage. I think one of the saddest things about that case was the way in which it was very unclear what the church felt about marriage, and that we were being put to proof in that case. There was muddle around what Christianity really viewed as marriage. Now that's because we have been muddled, that say we're Christians, but for the judge there would have been no issue around an Orthodox Jew and what they believed.
I've just seen Felix is watching the show.
Brilliant.
Hi, Felix.
Fantastic.
Felix.
Great to see you watching there.
He is a hero.
A hero of ours, absolutely. Yeah. So, Roger, can I ask you, because there's been a lot of, free speech is feeling very much under threat at the moment, and it's great that we're getting these legal wins. But, what about the Scottish hate crime laws which are being proposed, which, can you just talk about that? I mean, the idea is that they would threaten even quoting the Bible in your own home, right? Because they're saying that expand the definition of where you can speak freely to include not your home anymore.
Yeah, and this was a statement from the Justice Secretary in Scotland, and it's absolutely absurd that they want to be policing speech within the home. At the very least, what that's going to lead to is dysfunctional families, calling the police on each other to punish them, rather than any genuine, so it's going to make.
Well, Toby Young wrote an article about that. I might want to put the link up, but will my children report me to the police? And actually, that for a dysfunctional family, that would be a possibility under this.
And my comment would be, if the Justice Secretary is incompetent enough to come up with an idea that's silly, then how can we trust them to be competent enough to police that in itself?
But it's worse than that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Go on, Andrea. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, it's not just the Justice Secretary. What happens is that these laws are made, and then how they are outworked down through the system, how people understand them, is actually really horrifying on the ground. So Toby Young, in that piece, he mentioned Christy Higgs, our case. Remember, that was a pastoral assistant in a school who, simply for sharing a concern on Facebook about sex and relationships education and the books that were being pushed out, got reported by a so-called friend anonymously. We never knew who that friend was. And then dismissed from her job for gross misconduct over a 2-year process. That was snooping. But bear in mind the whole system then. The disciplinary system within the school, how people understood the regulations, then the governing body of the school, and then the employment judge and also the lay people on the employment tribunal, all interpreted the legislation, the rules. So as Roger says, if something is drafted that's so inept, that doesn't understand the times, that doesn't see how it can be used, then we can be sure that
what I was going to say, and hi, it's great to see Nigel and Sally Rowe watching us as well today. We've got a collection of
there's another free speech case. They were asking that their kids, and they would be required to use, compelled to use gender pronouns that they felt went against their conscience, or they would be viewed as transphobic. So it's another speech case in a sense.
Yeah.
More than that, but there is a speech element to it.
But Roger, you were blaming this individual politician in Scotland, but the Law Commission has done a review of hate speech, hate crime, whatever. And they want to make it that you can be prosecuted for what you say in your own home. So it's not just an individual. This is the Law Commission, right? This is the legal elites in our country who don't have no respect for free speech. They want to criminalize quoting the Bible in your own home.
And they want to criminalize not using the desired gender pronoun, and it is genuinely one of the most awful draft laws I've ever seen, and the damage it would do to the fundamental freedom of expression and to Christian belief and to really the manifestation of any belief in sexual purity or in gender as God ordained would be so damaging to culture. It's just 1984, really. It's Orwellian.
It is. Yeah. Well, listen, Roger, you did great work on that case. It was a fantastic win, the Mary Douglas case. Do read about it on our website. I'm sure our friends can post the link there if you haven't already done that. We continue to stand for free speech on this. So thank you, Roger. I wanted to move to another topic now, though.
Ben, just before you do that, just to say, and it really moves into the next topic as well. It's about more than standing for free speech. Because lots of people want to stand for free speech for various reasons, but at Christian Concern and all these people we have outlined, we've mentioned, and the wonderful Nigel and Sally Rowe are also watching, along with Felix and Gole. Just joy to work and with these people is they love the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And we are standing for truth and all the truth that flows from him. So when we contend for free speech and use the legal arguments around that and see that dulling in society, it's important for the whole of society. But what's going to really set society free is the truth, and the truth that flows from Christianity, in which there really is true toleration, in which we really can be free to speak. But that's what we are contending for in all of these cases, the glorious truth of Jesus Christ. And surely that is really missing in this next item that we're going to be talking about, the clarity of truth, because Jesus was always clear. He wasn't muddled. And I think that,
and he said some pretty straight up things, didn't he? Sometimes
he said some straight up things.
And
this issue, there can be no doubt that it was clear. And let me say, as we go into it, that part of the reason why we have difficulty in our cases, whether it's on what does it mean to be made male and female? So Nigel and Sally Rowe case, who weren't backed up by the Church of England Diocesan Education Board. That case will be coming soon. It really is. It's right on the cusp of being issued, the case of Nigel and Sally Rowe. But that case, in the case of Dr. David Macareth, the Church of England weren't clear on what on being made in God's image, male and female. Felix and Gole, Richard Page, Church of England, not clear on
John Parker,
governor, removed for asking a question about mermaids, the transgender group coming in, because the Church of England hasn't been clear.
He was a vicar as well, wasn't he? Vicar as well.
Yes, absolutely. So not even, and his bishop, now the Archbishop of York, would not stand with him.
Well, that leads straight into the next topic, doesn't it? There,
Surely does.
Let's bring Ben John on here. So, another thing that's happened this week is the Church of England has released a new report and a whole load of resources called Living in Love and Faith. And Ben, can you just explain where this has come from? What is this? Where's it come from? What is it that the Church of England has done here?
Yeah, so over the last 3 years or so, the Church of England set up this group called Living in Love and Faith, and there were different groups and committees and various numbers of people. And this was really born out of a report that the General Synod, Andrea might be able to speak more closely into this, voted not to take note of 3 years ago or so. It kind of affirmed biblical orthodoxy, but had generally a tendency in this report to be promoting generally turning a blind eye to practices, if I recall correctly. And so over the last 3 years, there's been conversations and research and listening to one another. And this is now the fruit of that. It looks like it's setting and paving the way for a possible change in the doctrine of marriage. In the next 2 years, the
LLF...
just
slow down there, Ben. That's a big deal, right? You said it's paving the way for changing the doctrine of marriage?
Possibly. Gosh. So in the next 2 years, the LLF Next Steps group...
Remember, it's never really clear. That's the point. You see, it's always incremental. And this has been incremental now over years. I mean, the church's silence around civil partnership, the church's acquiescence to civil partnerships.
Yeah, to be fair, what you have had headlines saying that, they're going to look at the doctrine of marriage in 2022. I've not heard any archbishop or bishop say, no, we're not going to revisit that. So that does look like it's going that way, doesn't it?
Well, I think what they're doing, and this is often what happens, is they're trying to have as broad a church as possible, as many options as possible. So in the terms of reference for the Next Steps group, which is comprised of people, bishops, it says it will draw up scenarios for different outcomes and consider the ecclesial implications. So presumably that would include how we would have gay marriage in the Church of England, and consider and bring forward to the House proposals for consideration of any motions or other business. So, I mean, it's feasible that the LLF Next Steps group choose not to propose anything about gay marriage. That is a possibility. But in general, the trajectory is ultimately where we already are is not good enough. Because the fact is we already have clergy, we already have bishops calling for a change. We have clergy who are in celibate civil partnerships. The fact is that we've already crossed so many lines. Where we already are isn't good enough.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we have an Archbishop of York who openly tolerates this and does not discipline within his previous diocese, who tells Orthodox who has really upset or forced out people they've been effectively forced out. They've left because of his stand on these things. We've had a very clear picture from the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Let's play the first 20-30 seconds of the Living in Love and Faith video promotion that the Church of England brought out, shall we?
I do expect people to respect me, but I don't expect people to know what to do with me. Some people might never have met a trans person before.
Marriage to us means just a deep sense of commitment.
Being a Christian and being gay, I found a brilliant church. I don't have to hide anything about myself.
Well, Ben, talk to us about that 25 seconds. What can you see there?
Well, there's a few alarming things there. I think immediately we're seeing a couple, both clergy, one of whom says, I'm a trans person. And yes, we need to love, walk alongside, be with those who suffer with gender dysphoria, which is a very real mental problem, psychological problem. But the fact is, clearly the Church of England has already endorsed and compromised this by ordaining trans people. And the way we talk about, okay, we're paving the way for gay marriage in 2 years' time, presumably that couple at the beginning were married. That is a gay wedding. That is a gay marriage.
Right.
Because he's not a man. We've got to be sensitive and gracious in how we speak about these things.
She's not a man. Yeah.
Yes. And it's sad because it's so
transgenderism right from the get-go, isn't it? There in the first 10 seconds, right?
It's also just confusing. I mean, it's really confusing. And I'm sitting here listening to my colleagues, and I know just how what we have said just now will be received like judgmental, harsh. Look at these lives. But this is how this resource is being opened, and it's the promotion of a sad delusion, sadly. We want hope and life and the freedom that Jesus gives. But this is the promotion of confusion and delusion and things which are not of God and contrary to the creation order. And that is heartbreaking. And it sets out just the most terrible witness for the world at large, which cannot understand these things. And sadly, what it also does is it closes us down, because to speak into this, you are immediately branded as hateful, not listening, homophobic, when actually our hearts are full of love for people in these situations and full of love for the glorious gospel, which is true. And which is what compels us to speak.
And I'm just thinking, of course, as we're on transgenderism, we just did a live stream promotion of a great resource, the Transgender Agenda, a DVD with expert scientists on the subject. So do watch that and follow up on that as well about this whole thing. But the Church of England has allowed, hasn't it? They've actually allowed the use of baptismal, what's it called, liturgy.
Yes.
I think the thing that frustrates me the most, and I know maybe in the things I've already said on here, it could come across sharp and angry, and we've got to be loving and gracious. I think the thing is there are two different groups of people. There are those outside the church that we do need to love,
absolutely,
and reach out to with the gospel. But the reality is that we're dealing with an internal battle in the church with leaders.
Yes.
The trans person in that was a clergyman. He's leading a church. She's leading a church. The bishops who are actively promoting false teaching. those are things that we cannot tolerate, and it's that I've much.
Well, let's put it clearer than that. The Bible says not to tolerate, doesn't it, Ben?
Well, yeah, of course.
And can I say as well, it's on that, you know, I mean, you know, I hate sin. I hate that anyone should go to hell. Yeah, that petrifies me. I want people to know Jesus Christ and be set free. I hate innocent people being led astray. I hate our children being taught terrible things that would hurt them. I hate confusion and that compels me to speak the truth. But do
you know the only reference to tolerance in the Bible is in that letter in Revelation, isn't it? Where it says, "I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel," which is she was promoting sexual immorality. That's what it has against the church. The thing you have against you is you're tolerating sexual immorality, or someone who teaches sexual immorality. But anyway, there's a question here from Ben. If you pick it up from Tim McShane, it's on Facebook. It's dumbing down the doctrine of marriage as Christ in the church to just an emotion and commitment, which can easily segue into any type of relationship where you feel committed. And that's I think he's picking up, Tim, there on the next little few seconds of that video, where they say, don't they, marriage to us is just a commitment. Is that what they say?
Yeah, marriage to us is just a commitment. And the thing is that even for, you know, marriage between a man and a woman, real marriage, as he said, we've dumbed down the doctrine of marriage. We don't understand what marriage is and for. And so because we don't do that, because we don't, particularly I feel in Protestant churches and in the Anglican church, we haven't been teaching and a robust theology of marriage. And I think that's where a lot of this comes down to, because I hear all the time, oh, you can't be opposed to stable, faithful, loving relationships, whoever they're between. And it's like, well, that's not really what marriage is and for. If marriage is just about commitment, then why do we not allow incestuous marriages? If that's about two loving, stable,
I'm very committed to my son. This is true. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what you guys can get married. So
yes.
Once you take it out, what marriage is for, and part of that includes procreation. Of course, you know, infertile couples are, of course, married. That's a result of the fall. The issue is same-sex marriage is inherently cut off from things like procreation and is inherently anti-creational.
Which, and that's, you're quoting there from like the Church of England doctrine of marriage, aren't you, when you say that?
Well, yes. If you in the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer, it lays out 3 reasons for why marriage was ordained as a creational ordinance by God before the fall, and it mentions procreation, protection against sin, and social and emotional harmony. So we've got a question here from Teresa on YouTube. Andrea, how can we fight these so-called, I think that's what she meant, church leaders in church?
Well, I suppose a little bit like what we're doing right now. We're seeking to expose it. And to help people understand the danger of these materials and what's actually being pushed out across the Church of England churches in this nation at this time. Honestly, the materials, I haven't got them here with me at the moment, but they look longer and more complicated than the Bible itself, in order to try and address what the doctrine of marriage is when it's quite clear. So first of all, we need to expose it. So we need to have the courage to take this up with our leaders, but we've got to equip ourselves. So, you know, we've got resources here at Christian Concern. There are other theology resources. I also see on a number of forums that there's a whole load of chat amongst evangelicals about how to engage with all of this, about how we've got to see the best and hope for the best in all of this. Well, you know, there is a fundamental error in all of this, and again, it's about time and resources, and so we need to be exposing this. We need to be going to our leaders. If we're within the Anglican circles, we need to be asking them. We need to be asking them to take this to the bishops and to the archbishops. And so it's about equipping one another and raising up the flag of true marriage and what it really means in our churches wherever we are. And I would like to see other denominations and other denominational leaders and other Christian leaders come out and speak clearly against this and clearly for what marriage is.
I think as well, we need to be careful to guard against this sort of insidious thing that, all these different views are equally valued and equally accepted. And that's what the message really seems to come across in the rest of the trailer. Because we might be tempted, or local parish churches in the Church of England might be tempted, these look like good resources for us to explore together. The LLF, the Living in Love and Faith 6-week course is something we can do together as a church, when in fact it's ultimately promoting pluralism. And what partnership can darkness have with light? We need to be clear on these. And so we need to warn congregants, church leaders, to guard against possibly using a lot of this material. Again, some of the material might be good, but that's often what's most destructive, is it takes something that's good, distorts it just a little bit, or says, yes, this is good, and this is also equally good, even though they're fundamentally irreconcilable.
But one thing that's the real sort of behind this is this question of church discipline, isn't it? That if you've got some doctrines, then people ought to hold to those doctrines, and if they don't, the church ought to say, well, you're no longer part of this church. I mean, so here we are. The Church of England is meant to be reviewing these doctrines. One can question whether you review them ever. Okay, but the conclusion of that should be, right, we remember what marriage is, and if you don't teach that, well, then you're not teaching what the church says, and therefore you're violating your oath or whatever it is and stuff. Isn't that the way it should go, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, church discipline is something that hasn't really been practiced in the Church of England for many years.
But
of course we hear
the wrong people get punished.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
if you sit where we sit, at Christian Concern, and you hear the stories that we hear, they are very distressing. Orthodox men are worn down, marginalized, pushed out. Those that actually try and stand up to the system are often worn down by the system. And so we need to create the counterculture. We need to create the and pray that God will bless a counter movement. And we've seen, some of these great men like Melvin Tinker and Peter Sandlon and others are really kind of, are speaking out. But there's
explain who they are, Andrea.
They're ministers who've been in the Church of England, who've left the Church of England. Other very good men don't leave with a blaze, perhaps as they have done, but leave more quietly, go and pastor other churches. But what we need is we need a counter church movement. We need the movement that speaks the truth. Can you imagine a kind of a real Wesleyan type of revival, when the church was nominal and John Wesley came out and confronted the establishment, generally not the social establishment and the church establishment, with truth, and revolutionized the gospel. We need that kind of counter movement, because there is silence from the other churches. It's not like it's just the Church of England. The Methodists have lost it. URC lost it. The Baptists are pretty silent. I don't want to be offending everyone here, because I love the church and I meet so many amazing people across all of these traditions, even the Pentecostals, in terms of public pronouncements on this.
But how do you see the future of the Church of England? And we've got some people asking here whether people should stay in the Church of England at all. When we've got headlines on newspapers saying church to reconsider the doctrine of marriage, and no bishop saying, "Oh no, we're not," or "over my dead body," or "I'll resign if that happens." So they're allowing, yes, we should reconsider the doctrine of marriage. What more fundamental doctrine is there? Not many. Where do we see the future
the
of
fact
this?
that they're even considering this, and the fact that we're saying, the bishops need to go on a learning exercise and listen to all these stories, it's already compromised. It's already flawed. And the thing is, there are some evangelical bishops, but I don't understand. They're so silent. We've just seen in America, Bishop Love, Bishop William Love, be disciplined for holding firm on marriage by not allowing gay marriages to happen in his diocese. Where were any of the bishops speaking up in support of him? Whereas here we have bishops that are tolerating anything.
Why would Archbishop of Canterbury, who invited Bishop Michael Curry, who disciplined Bishop Love, why wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, "What is Bishop Curry doing?" None of that. That the silence is deafening. The lack of the thing is, for me, you were talking earlier about those resources going into churches. Well, I've come to realize as I get older, the innocence of the flock, the innocence of people as they enter into these programs and things that are within the churches. And this is a little bit like the innocence of children when you give them material that isn't good for them on sex and relationships. You feed into the soul. Our souls should be fed with the truth of the living word of that which edifies us. But when we are fed with stuff that confuses and does not edify, then that is like poison for the soul. It's not truth for the soul.
Yeah, and it seems to me as well, Ben. The tone of this video is, "Hey, let's just accept everybody. Let's accept everybody," which is kind of like idolizing unity, isn't it? Because everybody should be part of it. Everybody should be welcome. Everybody should be part of this. Let's accept everybody. And if you make unity your God, then you have no doctrine. You can't.
Well, Tim, you quoted Revelation 2, Jesus' words to the church in Thyatira. I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality. But it goes on and says, I will throw into great tribulation those who commit adultery with her, unless they repent of her works, and I will strike her children dead. And the issue is we're seeing people who, yes, maybe hold orthodox views, but who are tolerating Jezebel and committing adultery with her and leading people into death and destruction. These things should not be tolerated. And if this is a real look, if this Next Steps committee are doing a real look at this Church of England teaching, one of the possibilities of the review ought to be that the liberals are expelled from the Church of England. That is bold, courageous, faithful leadership. That's what bishops vow to do at their consecrations. They say, I will vow to drive out all erroneous doctrine.
Well, on synod, people in leading positions are in open homosexual relationships, and they are tolerated and hold the keys to many of the synod bodies. And then they're not just tolerated on the floor of synod, they are revered. And I, a couple of times, have tried to call out bishops from the floor of synod who are leading the people astray, who are promoting wrong doctrine in public, and it is me for trying to do that in my role on synod. That is, well, at the very least, I can say it's much more than cold. It's much more than culture. I am not tolerated. So I am.
Well, you've got people like Jane Ozanne who are actively calling for people like us not to be tolerated, aren't they? I mean,
yes, they are. They're saying that we are dangerous. They're saying that we lead people to commit suicide. But also, it's the bishops that are around her. It's like the Bishop of Paul Bayes, the Bishop of Liverpool. I mean, he is out front and centre. Calling for this, gets lots of airtime on this, but also just look at the, Newcastle, even the Bishop of London, in terms of what's been put into her mouth this week, in terms of possible outcomes for this report. It's very concerning, indeed.
Yeah. And Paul Brown asks on YouTube, doesn't the CofE hold a privileged political position and a privileged position in our law? Well, it does, doesn't it, Andrea?
Indeed, it does, and that makes it even more serious, doesn't it, Ben? In those terms, we have bishops in the House of Lords, and they're not there for to speak truth. The role of this church is to speak. It is to be the prophet and the priest to the king, to be the prophet and the priest to the nation, to the parliament, to the ruling body. We have not been the prophet and the priest. The church has not been. We would not be having our cases. We would not have same-sex marriage. We wouldn't have 9.5 million abortions. We have been given a special place at the heart of government to speak to government, to be the spiritual element. Yeah.
And Andrea, there's a virtual synod later this month, isn't there? Is that right?
There is, yes.
So we should pray for that and pray for you to have a voice in that, as you do. You speak very prophetically and courageously in those synods.
I think as well, if the Church of England leaders had spoken boldly over these last few years or in this last generation, the culture would not be where it is now. And the issue is because our bishops have stayed silent, church leaders feel they have to stay silent. Because church leaders stay silent, their congregations are drifting off into false teaching or are too scared to say anything. This is what our leaders are supposed to be for, leading the way in pushing people, sharing, teaching doctrine, pointing people towards Christ. But sadly, they've abdicated that responsibility. And as Andrew mentioned, there are some false teachers in the House of Bishops that must be called out. But alas, they're able to get away with what they're doing. There are clergy able to get away with what they're doing. There are people like Jane Ozanne who are, I mean, it's not even in sheep's clothing. They're wolves in wolves' clothing, and we're not willing to do anything about it. And it's sad, it's frustrating, but we pray for the Church of England. We got to pray for the bishops because, as we said, they are in a privileged position. And if the Church of England does compromise, if it does redefine, change the doctrine of marriage, then I think that will have huge cultural effects on the nation. And people like Jane Ozanne have been saying, we don't want to tolerate orthodox biblical marriage at all. And that needs to be opposed. The fact that she's allowed in the Church of England, let alone on General Synod, let alone on any of these committees, is outrageous. But here we
Well, one of the revisionists on Synod, I remember on the floor of the House last Synod, he said, doctrine follows practice. And the truth is, he actually said that.
He said that. Doctrine follows practice.
Doctrine follows practice.
Completely the wrong way around, isn't it, Andrea? That's completely the wrong way around.
It's wholesale rebellion.
It's unbelievable.
What I'm also saddened by is that many of the growing, alive Anglican churches doing great work on the ground, their witness is compromised because of this. Their witness to the truth is compromised.
It is.
And in fact, our whole witness to the nation is compromised because of this.
Yeah.
So the Church of England has a peculiarly privileged position, but the Bride of Christ, the church generally, also we have not spoken as clearly as we should.
Yeah.
And it's time for repentance, Reformation, revival. Repentance can only come if the Lord, if we are crying out, those of us that love him are crying out and asking for him to come and to rescue us in this situation, for us to see a movement rise up. Well, I've been
well, the church thing is hemorrhaging members, isn't it? There are some good churches that are growing, but in general it's hemorrhaging members, and that's normal for liberal churches. When they go liberal, why bother going if they don't believe anything? They just believe in unity. Why bother being part of that kind of church? So we'll see where things go. Listen, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Roger, earlier as well. Thank you for joining us live on Facebook and YouTube. It's been great to see you. We've got a live discussion with the author of a new book that's coming out next week on Monday night. Book's called In His Image, and it's a really great exposition of biblical truths on some of the issues we've been discussing today. So do join us for that. I think it's 6 p.m. on Monday night. And also we'll see you here next week. If you're not already signed up to our emails, do sign up to those on our website. And you can be in touch with all this news as soon as it happens. We sometimes have breaking news emails. We're hoping to get you one this weekend. So do sign up for that as well. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.